I always thought of my grandfather as a kind, eccentric man, the kind who'd sneak me candy when my parents weren't looking, or tell me stories about the good old days that were probably exaggerated beyond belief. He had this small cottage on the outskirts of town, where he spent most of his time tinkering with little inventions or brewing different types of teas. The teas were his pride and joy. He had a collection of herbs and spices that filled up an entire pantry, each one labeled with its origin and purpose. I never questioned his obsession with it, thinking it was just another one of his quirky hobbies. But there was something else I didn't see back then. Something darker brewing beneath the surface. It all started one summer afternoon when I was visiting his cottage for the weekend. My parents were out of town, so I figured it would be a good time to spend some quality time with Gramps. As usual, he welcomed me with open arms and immediately offered me a cup of tea. "Got a new blend for you to try, sweetheart," he called from the kitchen, the familiar clinking of cups and spoons echoing through the small house. I wandered into the kitchen, watching as he carefully measured out loose tea leaves into a strainer. He was always so meticulous about it, making sure the proportions were just right. But today something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a nervous energy about him that I hadn't noticed before. "What kind of tea is this?" I asked, peeking over the counter. "Oh, it's a special mix I've been working on," he said with a tight smile, his hands moving a little too quickly. "Nothing like you've ever tasted." I smiled back, not thinking too much of it at the time. I loved trying new things, especially when it came to his teas. So, I accepted the cup he handed me without hesitation. But then something caught my eye. As he turned to grab the sugar, I saw him quickly slip a small vial from his pocket and pour its contents into the tea kettle. My stomach lurched. It was so fast, so subtle, that if I hadn't been standing at just the right angle, I would have missed it entirely. "What was that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Grandpa froze, his back still turned to me. For a second I thought he hadn't heard me. But then he turned around slowly, his face pale, the smile gone. "What was what, dear?" he asked, feigning innocence. "That thing you just poured into the kettle," I said, my heart pounding. "What was it?" He hesitated, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to come up with a plausible explanation. But I wasn't a child anymore, and I wasn't about to let him brush this off. "Grandpa, I saw you. What did you put in the tea?" For a long moment he didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me like he was weighing his options. Finally, he let out a sigh and put the cup down on the counter. "It's nothing to worry about," he said, his voice low. "Just a little extra flavoring." "Flavoring?" I repeated, my brow furrowing. "You're lying." He didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed the kettle and poured the tea down the drain, his hands shaking as he did. That's when I realized something was very, very wrong. "Why would you do that if it was just flavoring?" I pressed, stepping closer. "What's going on, Grandpa?" He turned to face me, his expression a mix of guilt and fear. "You shouldn't have seen that," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "You weren't supposed to be here." My heart dropped. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, there was a knock at the door. Both of us froze, the sound echoing through the quiet cottage. Grandpa's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, I saw genuine panic flash across his face. "I need you to go upstairs," he whispered urgently, his voice trembling. "Now." "Who's at the door?" "Go upstairs. Now." I hesitated, my mind racing. I wanted answers, but the fear in his voice was enough to make me move. I darted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest as I crouched by the top railing, trying to listen in on what was happening below. The door creaked open, and I heard my grandfather's low voice, muffled by the distance. I couldn't make out everything he was saying, but it was clear that whoever was at the door wasn't just a neighbor stopping by for a friendly chat. I held my breath as the conversation continued. The stranger's voice was deeper, gruffer, with a sense of urgency that made my skin crawl. "You got it?" the man asked. "Yeah, it's ready," Grandpa replied, his voice shaky. "You sure this is gonna work? I don't have time for mistakes." "It'll work," Grandpa assured him, though he didn't sound as confident as he usually did. "Just follow the instructions I gave you. You'll be fine." There was a pause, and I heard the sound of something being passed between them. My mind raced with questions. What were they talking about? What was my grandfather giving this man? And more importantly, why did it involve putting something in the tea? As the conversation came to an end, I heard footsteps moving toward the door again. I quickly scrambled away from the railing, trying to make myself as invisible as possible. The door closed softly, and for a moment, the house was eerily silent. Then Grandpa's heavy footsteps echoed up the stairs. I bolted to my room, my heart racing as I sat on the edge of the bed, pretending like I hadn't just eavesdropped on the entire conversation. When he finally appeared in the doorway, he looked older than I had ever seen him. Tired. Defeated. "What's going on, Grandpa?" I asked softly, my voice barely above a whisper. For a long time he just stood there, looking at me like he didn't know what to say. Then finally, he let out a long sigh and walked into the room, sitting down beside me. "There are some things you don't understand," he said quietly, his hands clasped together in his lap. "Things I didn't want you to know about." "What did you give that man?" I asked, my stomach churning with dread. Grandpa looked down at his hands, his knuckles white from how tightly he was gripping them. "It's a product. Something I've been working on for a while. It's valuable and some people are willing to pay good money for it." "Is it illegal?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. My mind raced, a whirlpool of confusion and fear. This man, my grandfather, the one who taught me how to ride a bike, who sat with me during thunderstorms and told me it would all be okay, was involved in something dangerous. Something illegal. I could feel it in the way his shoulders slumped and in the way he refused to look me in the eye. "What's in the tea, Grandpa?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What are you putting in it?" For a long time he just sat there staring at his hands. Finally he let out a shaky breath. "It's something I shouldn't have made. It's a mixture. Some chemicals I've been experimenting with." "Chemicals?" My heart sank even further. "What do you mean, chemicals? You always told me your teas were natural, herbs and spices. What's in this one?" He closed his eyes as if saying the words would make it all too real. "I've been working with a man from out of town. He's part of a group. They're interested in substances that can alter a person's state of mind." My stomach turned. "Drugs? You're putting drugs in the tea." He flinched but didn't deny it. "Not exactly," he muttered. "It's experimental. Something that enhances focus and clarity, but in high doses it can be dangerous." Dangerous. The word echoed in my mind, each syllable heavier than the last. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My grandfather, the man who had always preached about the benefits of natural remedies and holistic living, was making and selling dangerous drugs. "And you're selling it to people? Letting them drink it?" "I'm not," he started to protest, but then stopped, his face crumpling with guilt. "I didn't want to get involved in this, but I had no choice. They came to me, they knew about my work, and I owe them money. A lot of money. This was the only way out." I shook my head, unable to process it all. "How could you do this? How could you risk people's lives like this?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "I never wanted you to find out. I didn't want you to be part of this. But I am part of it now," I said, my voice hard. "I saw what you did and I heard everything. You can't keep me in the dark anymore." There was a long, suffocating silence as he struggled with the weight of his own guilt. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I know I've messed up. I know I've put myself and you in danger. But I can't stop now. If I don't deliver the next batch, they'll come after me. They'll come after us." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are they, Grandpa? Who are these people?" He hesitated, then glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be listening. "It's better if you don't know their names. They're not the kind of people you want to cross." "But you crossed them," I pointed out, my voice shaking with anger and fear. "You're mixed up in something way over your head, and now you've dragged me into it too." "I didn't mean to," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this," I shot back. "We need to go to the police. We need to tell them what's going on before it's too late." "No." His response was sharp, immediate. His eyes were wide with panic. "We can't. You don't understand, they'll kill us both if we go to the cops. They've got people everywhere. If they find out I talked, I won't make it to the end of the week. And neither will you. My blood ran cold at the thought. Whoever these people were, they weren't just dangerous, they were ruthless. And my grandfather had gotten himself, and now me, entangled in their web of deceit and crime. I sat in stunned silence, my mind racing. What could we do? What could I do? If we couldn't go to the police, and if these people were really as dangerous as he said, then we were trapped. Trapped in this mess of his creation. Is there another way out? I asked quietly, my voice shaking. Is there anything we can do? Grandpa looked at me, his face pale and drawn. There's only one way out, he said softly. I need to finish this last batch. After that, they'll let me go. And you believe them? I asked, incredulous. You think they're just going to let you walk away after you've been working with them? What if they don't? What if they ask for more? What then? I don't have a choice, he said, his voice cracking. This is the only option I have left. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. There has to be another way. There has to be something else we can do. But deep down I knew there wasn't. I could see it in his eyes, the way they had lost their usual spark. He was trapped, and in trying to save himself, he had put us both in danger. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. I can't be a part of this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I won't let you drag me down with you. I never wanted that, he said softly. I never wanted you to know. I turned and walked out of the room, the walls of the cottage suddenly feeling like they were closing in around me. I needed to get out, to clear my head, to figure out what to do next. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I realized that everything had changed. My grandfather, the man I had trusted more than anyone, had betrayed that trust. He had put me in danger, and now I had to decide how far I was willing to go to protect both of us. But one thing was clear, I couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. The next morning I made a decision. I had to do something, even if it meant risking everything. I couldn't let him go through with it. I couldn't let him ruin more lives or his own. So I packed a small bag and left the house, determined to find help, whether he wanted it or not. What I didn't know then was that by the time I came back, everything would be different. And Grandpa's fate would be sealed. I didn't go to the police right away. I wasn't sure if that was the right move, not with the way my grandfather had reacted when I suggested it. His words about the people he was involved with, the danger that lurked if we went to the authorities, haunted me. But I knew I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. So I went to the only person I could think of, my uncle, my grandfather's younger brother, who lived on the other side of town. Uncle Ron had always been a bit of a black sheep in the family, the kind of man who kept to himself and didn't meddle in anyone's business. But he was sharp, practical, and someone who knew how to navigate tricky situations. If anyone could give me advice without blowing things out of proportion, it was him. I knocked on his door with trembling hands, hoping he'd know what to do. When he opened the door, his face immediately filled with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, ushering me inside. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I've seen something worse," I muttered, and before I knew it, the whole story came spilling out. I told him about the tea, the chemicals, the strange man at the door, and the terrifying reality of what my grandfather had been doing. I half expected Uncle Ron to brush it off or laugh at the absurdity of it all, but instead, his face grew dark with worry. "This is bad, kid," he said, running a hand through his graying hair. "Real bad." "I know," I whispered. "I don't know what to do." For a long moment, Uncle Ron sat in silence thinking. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and serious. "Your grandfather has gotten himself mixed up in something way over his head. He's playing with fire, and those people, whoever they are, they won't just let him walk away. If they think for even a second that he's trying to back out, they'll come after him. And they won't stop with him." I swallowed hard, the fear rising in my chest. "But what can we do?" Uncle Ron leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "We have to go to the authorities." I shook my head, panic seizing me. "But Grandpa said." "I know what he said." Uncle Ron cut me off, his voice firm. "But he's scared. And when you're scared, you don't think straight. The only way to get out of this is to get ahead of it. If we go to the police and tell them everything, they can protect him. They can protect you." The idea of turning my grandfather in made my stomach churn, but I knew he was right. There was no way Grandpa could handle this alone. If we didn't act, he'd end up even deeper in trouble or worse, dead. Reluctantly, I nodded. Okay, but we have to do it carefully. I don't want anything to happen to him. Uncle Ron gave me a reassuring pat on the back. Don't worry. I've got some connections down at the precinct. We'll make sure it's done quietly. No one will know until it's too late for those people to retaliate. The plan was simple enough. We'd tell the police everything we knew, and they'd set up a sting operation to catch the men my grandfather had been dealing with. They promised to protect him to make sure he wasn't harmed in the process, but there was no denying it. The moment we walked into that station, Grandpa's life would change forever. The drive back to the cottage was tense. I had called ahead to let my grandfather know I was coming, but I didn't tell him about the police. I needed him to stay calm, to not suspect anything until it was time. When we pulled up in front of the house, Uncle Ron stayed in the car, keeping an eye on things while I went inside. "Grandpa," I called, stepping into the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed tea hit me, but it no longer brought comfort. Now it only reminded me of the nightmare we were caught in. He appeared in the doorway, his face etched with worry. "Where have you been?" I was worried sick. "I went to see Uncle Ron," I admitted, my heart pounding in my chest. His face paled. "What did you tell him?" I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything, Grandpa." I told him everything. For a moment he just stood there, staring at me as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then his face twisted in anger. "You had no right," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You don't understand what you've done. I'm trying to help you." I shot back, tears welling up in my eyes. "You're in way over your head, and I couldn't just sit back and let you ruin your life or mine. The police are going to help us. They're setting up a sting operation to catch those men." His eyes widened in terror. "No, you don't understand. If they find out, they'll kill me. They'll kill us both." "They won't find out," I insisted, trying to stay calm. "The police know what they're doing. They're going to protect you." But Grandpa wasn't listening. He paced back and forth, his hands pulling at his hair, muttering under his breath. "I've ruined everything. I've ruined everything." I tried to reach out to him to calm him down, but he was too far gone. In his panic, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "Grandpa, wait!" I cried, chasing after him. "You can't leave. You'll make things worse." But he was already out the door, his feet carrying him toward the woods that bordered the back of the property. I followed, my heart racing, but I couldn't catch up. He was moving too fast, too frantic. Just as I was about to call out to him again, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police had arrived, their cars pulling up the driveway, red and blue lights flashing in the twilight. "Grandpa, stop!" I screamed, but it was too late. He had already disappeared into the trees. The officers rushed out of their vehicles, fanning out around the property. Uncle Ron joined me, his face grim as we watched the scene unfold. The officers called for backup, setting up a perimeter to ensure my grandfather wouldn't get far. For hours we waited, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. Finally, just before dawn, they found him. He had collapsed in the woods, exhausted and terrified, but unharmed. They brought him back to the house in handcuffs. His eyes were hollow, his face pale, and the weight of what had happened seemed to settle over him like a heavy fog. As they led him away, he didn't say a word. I watched as the police car drove off, taking him to face the consequences of his actions. My heart felt like it was breaking in two, but I knew there was no other way. Grandpa went to prison for his involvement in the drug ring. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was the only one that could have saved him from something worse. I visited him sometimes, and each time he looked a little older, a little more worn down by the weight of his choices. But he was safe, and so was I, and that, in the end, was all that mattered.